Hello everyone and welcome back to another Patreon exclusive ink and watercolor wash tutorial. I am so happy and excited to be sharing this one with you today. This one is going to be super thorough and it's actually going to be a sketching and painting tutorial basically combined into one because I am taking you through my entire process, starting from how I create my own sketch to work from in my drawing sketchbook. Basically using 3 reference photos for inspiration and combining them into one same window drawing. And of course, as I am creating my sketch, I'm going to be providing you tons of tips and tricks along the way that are going to help you improve your drawing and sketching. After finishing up with my graphite drawing and having arrived at a nice window sketch that I feel will translate well into a pen and wash painting, I am then going to show you how I transfer my outline sketch onto my sheet of watercolor paper using tracing paper, and then I am going to show you how I go about with my ink line work and my alternative shading techniques so that we can then finally move on to adding washes of color using watercolor. However, as always, my downloadable outline sketch, my supply list, and my high-resolution reference photo are available for you down below at the end of this post. And if you're only interested in one part of this process, so for example, if you are only interested in sketching this with pen and ink and leave it as a black and white piece, or if you're interested in only doing the watercolor section, then that's perfectly fine as well. You can transfer my outline sketch onto your sheet of watercolor paper and skip onto that part of the video. I'm going to make sure to leave timestamps for you down below in the text section of this post so that you can know where the different parts of the video start. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and talk you through the supplies that I'm going to be using for today's piece, just so that you can make sure that you have everything that you need on hand. So as I was mentioning before, I'm going to be sharing my actual freehand sketching process with you before getting into the later phases for this piece. And for this, I'm going to be using my Canson drawing sketchbook. For this sketching phase, I'm going to be using a regular HB drawing pencil. If you have not checked out my drawing mini course for the total beginner and you're not aware of what different pencil grades are, what they are for, how they can come in handy during the drawing or sketching process, I highly recommend checking out that mini course. I'm going to be leaving a link to that one down below in the text section of this post. It's completely 100% free for Patreon community members. All right, so aside from my HB drawing pencil, I also have an 8B drawing pencil. It's right above it right there on the screen. This one is not really necessary. I'm just going to be using it to point some things out as I am in this first stage of the process developing my freehand sketch. I also have a soft graphite eraser. I love these erasers. They are so soft. For some reason, I love how they smell. And this eraser is going to come in handy as I am creating my drawing, as well as later on if I have any further graphite markings to remove from my painting. I can do that as well using this very soft eraser that I know is not going to damage my watercolor paper. I have a sheet of tracing paper on hand so that I can transfer my sketch onto my sheet of watercolor paper. And if you've never used tracing paper before, don't worry, I'm going to explain how to use it. And I'm also going to make sure to leave you a suggestion of some tracing paper that I have used before and that has worked great for me in your supply list for this tutorial. In that part of the process, I'm also going to be explaining why personally I like using tracing paper for my transferring as opposed to other transferring methods. I have, of course, my Staedtler pigment liner. This is a 0.2 tip. And of course, because we're going to be adding watercolor washes on top of our ink line work, it does offer waterproof ink, which is always super important. In terms of the paper that I'm going to be using my Arches cold press 140 pound watercolor paper. From this watercolor paper pad that I am sharing on screen, this pad is 9 by 12 inches. I buy it via Amazon, and I am not going to be using the entire sheet for this little illustration or watercolor painting today. I'm going to be using a piece, and this piece is approximately 9 inches in height and a little over 6 inches in width. I often like cutting up my sheets of watercolor paper, especially when it comes to more expensive paper like this one, because as you know, not only am I a huge proponent for smaller sketches and explorations, for developing our skills and trying out new techniques, but also this helps me make my watercolor paper last a longer time, especially because I'm constantly creating tutorials and teaching classes. Have in mind though that you don't need to use this exact same paper to obtain great results. And also remember that whenever it is you're going to be using a drawing pen, it's important to remember that the more textured your paper is, the more likely it is that your line work is not going to be able to be laid down as smoothly as when you're using smoother paper. So this Arches paper has a texture to it. In other pen and watercolor wash tutorials that I've shared here on Patreon, I've been using the hot press paper, which doesn't have a texture to it. It's a lot smoother. But this time, I just wanted to give the cold press paper a try. Okay, moving on to the paint that I'm going to be using for the watercolor phase, and these are all colors from my Van Gogh Botanical Half Pan set that I also bought via Amazon. And the exact 6 colors that I'm going to be using for this piece are Transparent Yellow Medium, Raw Sienna, Burnt Sienna, Ultramarine Deep, Sap Green, and Permanent Blue Violet. Now remember, you do not have to use the exact same paint colors that I am using. You can use any colors that are similar to these that you have available. And in fact, if you don't like purple and want to change that kind of pop of color in this painting to another color completely, you can go ahead and do that as well. I'm going to be using only one size 14 round brush for the entire watercolor painting process. And this is because I want to keep everything nice and loose and fresh. And of course I have on hand my absorbent blue Scotch Shop towel. I also get those via Amazon. I love them because I can reuse them again and again. And any sort of absorbent towel, even a regular kitchen paper towel, is super important to have on hand whenever you're painting with watercolor. I also have my roll of regular 1-inch masking tape to tape my watercolor paper down onto my green cutting mat. You can use any sort of backing board that you'd like. I'm going to give you tips and tricks so that you can avoid damaging your watercolor paper with your masking tape when we are at that point of the process. And finally, the other 2 things that I have on hand are my container with clean water and my ceramic paint mixing palette. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with talking about the reference photos that I am using to get some ideas for my sketch. These are all images that I found via the free photography websites that I've shared with you guys before, Unsplash, Pixabay, Pexels, all of those. I knew since the beginning that I wanted to create a painting of a window that was a little bit more old style, not too contemporary. And I'm also really drawn to colorful French windows. So that's something that I definitely knew I wanted to do since the beginning. I knew that I wanted greens and plants around the window. And also I am very drawn to brick walls. So I looked up a reference of bricks and I had this in my mind as I was creating my window drawing, basically from imagination, after having gained some inspiration from these images. These images also helped me arrive at somewhat of a color palette that I would be using for my painting. So some of my color choices were informed by my reference photos, and others I just brought in entirely on my own. So this is a great way and a very fun way as well to use reference photos because I am using them for capturing nuances, subtleties in terms of shadow placement, color, detail, and stuff like that. But at the same time, I'm really bringing in my creativity and my own style into the picture. Remember that you never have to slave over reference photos. Just because you're using a reference photo doesn't mean that you're trying to replicate it exactly and trying to create a photorealistic drawing or painting from it. This may be your objective for some kinds of studies, but in others, you may be using your references in an entirely different way, and this is perfectly fine. And I would actually encourage you to explore different ways that you can use your reference photos because there are so many ways that we can use them. All right, so right here I have my piece of my artist paper. This is the 6.25 times 9-inch piece that I was talking about before. And as you can see, I actually very carefully trace over this rectangle on my drawing sketchbook so that I can make sure that the sketch that I create on my drawing paper on this sketchbook is in the size that I want it to be before I actually transfer it onto my sheet of watercolor paper that I'm going to be using, so that I don't have to cut out or crop out any sections of this window that I really want to be made part of the piece, and at the same time so that I don't have too much empty or negative space around these elements. So I would always recommend, if you're going to be creating your pencil sketch on a separate sketchbook or a separate sheet of drawing paper, and then you're going to be transferring it onto your sheet of watercolor paper, create that sketch in the exact same size that you want your final painting to be, because this way you don't have to do any resizing or any extra steps in between. Okay, so right here, I am using my HB pencil very, very lightly. I am really sorry if my lines are very light, but this is actually the amount of pressure that I like creating my drawings with, especially when I'm just getting started with placing those largest and most general shapes, because drawing and sketching is a refinement process. And I want to be able to erase my mistakes along the way, and drawing lightly allows me to do that without completely messing up my drawing. So I'm going to walk you through what I have in my mind whenever I am creating a new sketch like this. First and foremost, it's important to think of basic, general, largest shapes first. Get those down correctly, and then you can start adding in smaller details. This is something that I do whether I am creating a drawing from my imagination the way I'm doing right now, or whether I am using only one reference photo that I am trying to replicate to the best of my abilities. I always simplify whatever it is I am looking at into basic shapes first, start laying those shapes down, and focus on overall proportion and shape and placement within space. Perspective is another key thing to have in mind in this part of the process, because if any of these things are off, then nothing that we do afterwards, no amount of shading, whether we're going to be using a pencil or a pen in this case, or even watercolor, no amount of texture, no amount of color is going to fix this base preliminary foundation that we're working on right now. So I really like taking my time with this preliminary sketch. I am tuning out all of the smaller details completely. I am not thinking about shading. I am not thinking about texture. I am not thinking about anything else except basic largest shapes. And in this case, you might find using a ruler handy. It depends on your own personal drawing skills, because we're working on a kind of architectural element right now that has a lot of symmetry to it, a lot of straight verticals and horizontals. Then using a ruler could come in handy for you, and there's no shame in that. If you feel you need a ruler, go ahead and use it. You probably saw when I started with this pencil sketch, I just laid down basic horizontals for myself, then basic vertical lines, in order to start visualizing the size that I wanted that window to be. And with those horizontals and verticals in place, I then started working my way inwards. I constantly measured things out. You can use the negative space around the window as well as the edges of the rectangle that you created to draw in as reference for yourself to measure things out, as well as to lay down those lines as straight as possible. And the more elements and shapes that you start placing in your drawing, the more points of reference you're gonna have to continue comparing your different elements and shapes with. As I am doing this, I am constantly measuring things out and comparing them in terms of their length, width, location within space, the angles they create with each other, as well as with the edges of this rectangle that I created in the beginning. So really arriving at effective proportion and even symmetry in this case is a matter of constantly comparing, constantly observing the different elements, the alignment of these elements, and the sizes of these elements. Arriving at effective proportions is, of course, way more difficult when you're drawing something like a face or an animal, which requires knowledge of very specific proportions like facial proportions, anatomical proportions, etc. But this is a great exercise because it allows you to start developing that ability to visually measure things out and replicate them completely freehand. Right now, because this sketch is mostly created from my imagination and I'm not really trying to replicate any specific proportions, I am mostly focusing on using the space that I'm going to be creating this artwork in effectively, creating a nice visual composition, and of course I am focusing on symmetry and creating believable shapes for what it is I am trying to draw. So right here you can see how I've started adding in smaller details after those larger shapes had been created effectively. I am still drawing very, very lightly so that I can go ahead and erase any mistakes I need to erase. Drawing lightly and doing your best to use the entire arm as opposed to only your wrist when you're drawing or painting is a skill that you need to practice in the beginning. It can be a little bit uncomfortable because we're trained since we're little to really grab a hold of our pencils and pens with a lot of control because we're writing with these tools. And so when we're getting started with drawing, we automatically want to grab onto our pencil or even our paintbrush, and when we're starting to paint, in a very tight, controlled way, and it's uncomfortable to hold our pencil from higher up in its handle, which, by the way, if you're interested in learning more about different ways to hold your pencil for drawing, make sure to check out that first class of my drawing mini course for the total beginner, because I explain all about that in that class. It can also be uncomfortable in the beginning to move your entire arm as opposed to only your wrist, which is probably what you have been doing your entire life. However, the more you remind yourself of these things, the easier it gets with time and practice. For me, drawing lightly is important because A, I am able to erase my mistakes with no problem. B, I don't damage my paper. And C, because I'm going to be creating a watercolor painting with this, and watercolor is transparent, I don't want to see my pencil work show through my paint at the end. Not to mention, if I were creating this preliminary sketch with the intention of developing, different values with it via layers of graphite and all of that in order to create more of a realistic study, then I wouldn't want this outline sketch to be visible at the end, because in realism there are no outlines. If I were creating a believable drawing from this sketch, then at the end, after all of my values have been developed, this outline sketch should not be visible. Okay, so I am in the final stages of this preliminary freehand outline sketch right here. I finished up with all of the basic shapes in my focal point, which is the window, and I also started adding in the illusion of some bricks here and there around it. And I basically finished up with all of the more irregular, more abstract, organic shapes around them. I added in the plants below the window, as well as the visible leaves of the tree above the window in a very, very loose way. You can see how these are basically scribble marks. And you can see right there in this close-up how I am really not connecting them because I am trying to stay away from the look of outlines around those leaves. I am just creating these scribble marks in segments, so to speak. You can see little small sections of paper in which those lines are not even connected. And to create those scribble marks, I'm just basically allowing my entire arm and wrist to move in different directions. I am really mentally just staying away from the repeating of specific patterns or creating specific loop shapes, because that is going to lead to everything looking too organized, and we really want to keep everything irregular when we're drawing or painting in something natural like leaves and plants and trees and flowers and stuff like that. Irregularity is super important for this kind of element. Right here, I am adding a little pile of pieces of wood, which is something that I really liked in one of the pictures. I intentionally made this little pile a little bit more to the left because there is already a lot of symmetry involved in this piece when it comes to the focal point, which is the window. And so I wanted to make sure to add a lot of asymmetry and irregularity in the more natural elements that I am adding in around the window. I really thought that this would help make the piece more interesting and that I would create a sense of contrast between the more man-made kind of geometric shapes and forms in combination with the more organic natural elements. I wanted to share these little cylinder drawings with you in case you're having trouble visualizing those little wood beams or little wood sections. It can definitely be tricky to draw the little pile of wood because there's so many overlapping elements, and especially if you don't have practice with drawing three-dimensional forms like cylinders, it can be a little bit tricky. And this is why I always say that practicing geometric forms such as cylinders, rectangular prisms, cubes, triangular prisms, things like that is so important, and practicing them in different angles and perspectives. Because what you need to understand is that everything, absolutely everything around you can be visualized as simple geometric forms. And when it came time to visualize those little wooden beams that I would be adding under the window so that I could then draw them, what I am seeing in my head is a basic cylinder. And yes, of course, these pieces of wood are not perfect cylinders. And I did my best to get them in little irregular kind of forms and planes, but at its basic structure form, it's essentially a cylinder. Or it could also be visualized as a long rectangular prism jutting out towards you as a viewer of the scene. And by visualizing them as basic cylinders or rectangular prisms, I am more easily able to create a believable illusion of a pile of wood. Drawing 3D forms effectively in a scene also goes hand in hand with understanding perspective, which perspective is really present in all kinds of art, and it's an art fundamental to learn about. Practicing drawing 3D forms in things like the 1, the 2, and the 3-point perspective grids is also very helpful, and something I would always recommend anyone just getting started with drawing do. All right, so having said all that, right here, after having finished with my sketch, I am going over my main lines with my 8B pencil. You don't really have to use an 8B pencil. You can just retrace over your main shapes in your sketch using your same HB pencil or whatever pencil grade you were using before. The reason why I am tracing over my lines at this point is because I want to be able to see them through my tracing paper, which I'm going to be placing on top. And you can see how I am doing this pretty quickly. I am even leaving certain little details out that I feel I can just draw freehand directly on my watercolor paper with no problem. Something I want to mention here in this part of the process in which I would consider us to be preparing for the actual piece and planning our visual composition and everything like that is I want to remind you to see this part of the process as an equally important part as what's going to happen next. Because this is the part of the process at which we're designing our composition so that it can look balanced and harmonious and visually impactful. And our brains are also getting to work in terms of how we're going to be bringing ourselves into the creative process. This is also a phase in which my brain is starting to get to work in terms of what mark making and alternative shading techniques I'm going to be using during the pen and ink phase. And what techniques am I going to be using in the watercolor wash phase? Am I going to be using wet on dry, wet on wet? How much layering I'm going to have to get done. I'm giving thought to all of that as I am working on this. And really, if we go in with a strategy, knowing, at least having a general idea of what we want things to look like at the end, and we approach this with a sort of strategy in mind, then we're much more likely going to have a more successful process as well as outcome. And unfortunately, this is something that I see a lot of beginners jump over completely, or not spend enough time on. I want to encourage you, especially if you're going to be working on more of a finalized piece, to make at least a little bit of time for planning and preparation, because just a few minutes can go a very long way. This doesn't really apply for smaller sketches and isolated studies and things like that, but whenever you're gonna be spending, let's say, more than an hour on a piece, I would say at least set aside 15 minutes to plan your colors, to observe your reference photo, and to think of how you can improve the composition overall, and think of how you can start bringing yourself into the picture. After tracing over all of the main things with a little bit more pressure and this darker and softer pencil grade, I decided to go in and very quickly create some hatching for myself so that I can get a clear idea in my head and have this on hand throughout both my inking and my watercolor painting process, in order to know where my shading or areas of darkest darks are going to be developed. Shading and making sure that you have an idea of where you're going to be developing those darkest darks is very, very important before getting started with any sort of painting process. It's important to give thought to where our light source is going to be located in relation to the subject that we're drawing or painting, which in this case, because I am drawing this from my imagination, I decided that the light source is going to be located somewhere to the top left of this window. And the reason why it's so important to go in knowing these things is because the shadows and the midtones and the lights, they have to make sense, and you have to keep them cohesive and consistent throughout whatever it is you're drawing or painting for the scene to look somewhat believable. All right, so having said all that, it's time to get started with the transferring process. So here is my sheet of tracing paper, and you can see me tracing over the entire thing. This time I am using my HB pencil. You can see me going over my sketch with somewhat messy lines. It's important that when you're using tracing paper, you lay down a good amount of graphite on your tracing paper. Otherwise, that graphite is not going to be transferred. So every line I go over, I'm actually going over it like 2 or 3 times to make sure that I am depositing a good amount of graphite on my tracing paper. This is very, very important, because if you just go over it once with one very clean line, then most likely than not, you're gonna have trouble transferring your drawing onto your sheet of watercolor paper. So take your time with this, trace over every line that you want to make sure to transfer onto your watercolor paper. I'm also applying a lot more pressure than I was applying when I was creating my initial freehand sketch. When you're using tracing paper, it's pretty common that the tip of the pencil that you're using gets blunt pretty fast, because you're pressing down with way more pressure and you're actually going back and forth on this sheet in almost every single line. So if that happens to you, don't worry about it. It's completely normal. Just sharpen your pencil once again. I'm gonna go quiet for a bit as I continue working on this tracing. Okay, so I'm almost done here, just tracing over these pieces of wood at the bottom. And as you can see, I am done with my tracing. All of the most important parts of my picture are on my tracing paper. What we have to do next is trace over our entire sketch once again in the opposite side of our tracing paper. Why, you might ask? Because we want to actually transfer this image in the opposite direction from what our graphite on our tracing paper would at this point allow. So basically, the side of the tracing paper that comes into contact with our sheet of watercolor paper has to have the graphite that is going to get transferred onto it. At this point, only the side of the tracing paper that was previously upwards facing us, right, when we were just doing the tracing a moment ago, is the one that contains the graphite. So the only way that I could transfer this image was if I turned it upside down, and this would create a mirrored version of the image that we're trying to produce. So I hope that that makes sense. Now, if you were tracing over one single photo that you were using as a reference, let's say for a watercolor painting, then something that I would do in order to avoid having to trace over your tracing paper twice on both sides would be to open up my photograph in Photoshop or some sort of photo editing software, flip my image horizontally, mirror that image, right? And print it out in this flipped version. Then you trace over that with your tracing paper, and you already have that graphite on the side of the tracing paper that you actually need for your painting. And really, with this particular case, I feel both sides would look okay. If I decided to flip this image and paint it in that way, then it would still look very nice. But I just wanted to go through this process with you and talk it through so that you know what to do in the future when you're working on specific situations or specific pieces. Just remember that the side of your tracing paper that contains the graphite, right, is the one that is going to get transferred onto your watercolor paper. You need that graphite on the face of the tracing paper that is coming into direct contact with your watercolor paper. Otherwise, nothing is going to get transferred. Now, I mentioned before that I was going to let you know why using tracing paper is my own preferred transferring method of choice, because there are definitely many different ways that you can transfer your outline sketch or your photo onto your sheet of watercolor paper. So the reason why I currently like using tracing paper most for my transferring, whenever I do transferring, because other times I do just sketch freehand on my watercolor paper whenever I feel I have drawn that subject enough and I have enough practice. I just go ahead and draw freehand on my watercolor paper. But whenever I have to transfer something, I use tracing paper because it's inexpensive. I sometimes reuse my little drawing that I have on my tracing paper multiple times because it's already on there. You can use it like a sort of plaque that is already created for you. You can also buy tracing paper in all sorts of sizes, including very large sheets if that's what you need. And aside from all of this, light boxes can be very expensive. And if and when I do get a light box, I want to make sure that it's a good one that is going to last me a very long time, which of course requires me planning and saving up a bit of money for that, which hasn't been my priority. Another thing that I've tried doing is using a window to trace over as a sort of natural light box. And what happens whenever I do this is that my eyes start hurting and tearing up because I have very sensitive eyes. So I always come back to this method. At least for now, it's what works for me. And if I ever invest in a light box, you can trust me to share my experience with whatever one I decide to get for sure. For me, working on my freehand sketching is also very, very important. So if I do trace over anything, I would rather it be a sketch that I created freehand like I did today. And of course, there are other times that I do trace over photos, like for example, at times when I really want to focus more on the painting process, or when I have to create a tutorial or work on something and I'm just lacking the time to create that drawing freehand, I also allow myself to trace over photos. But for the most part, I really like enjoying and setting aside the time to do my freehand drawing, because I know that this is going to bring me more growth. It's going to continue helping me develop my observational skills, my hand-eye coordination. It's going to help me continue to develop my ability to measure things out visually. Not to mention, at the end, my piece is a lot more likely to have more of myself in it and all of these things. So whenever I'm able, I like to create that preliminary freehand sketch freehand. Okay, so just a moment ago, I started taping my watercolor paper down onto my green cutting mat. You can see that this is just regular plain old masking tape. And the only thing that I made sure to do before using it to tape my watercolor paper down is with each section of masking tape that I cut from my roll, I pasted it onto my clothes a couple of times to soften that adhesive before using it on my watercolor paper. This makes it a lot more likely that when it comes time to removing this masking tape at the end, I am not going to damage my watercolor paper. Something that's important for me to mention here before I forget when it comes to using masking tape on your watercolor paper is that the thinner your watercolor paper is and the lower quality it is, the more likely it is that you're going to damage your paper when you pull off that masking tape at the end. So when I have used watercolor paper that is at least 140 pounds in thickness or higher, I have never damaged my watercolor paper when removing my masking tape at the end. Of course, after having allowed my entire painting to dry completely. But when I use thinner, cheaper watercolor paper, I have damaged it. So just have that in mind. All right, so with my watercolor paper taped down onto my cutting mat properly, it was now time to actually transfer my sketch onto it. So right here, you can see how I've aligned, I've centered the image on my tracing paper on my sheet of watercolor paper just the way I want it. You can see how I have actually placed this image in the direction that I want to transfer it in. And I am tracing everything over one last time using my sharpened HB pencil. I am pressing down a little bit harder so that the graphite that is opposite to this side that I am actually doing this scribbling on gets transferred onto my watercolor paper. Because I am using cold press watercolor paper today that has quite a bit of texture on it, it's a lot more likely that a less amount of graphite is going to get transferred onto it when compared to using something like hot press watercolor paper. When you're transferring onto any sort of smoother paper that doesn't have as much texture or tooth to it, then that image is going to get transferred a lot more clearly because the graphite can be deposited in a more uniform way. So it's just something to have in mind. What's important is that you're able to see the main shapes, the largest shapes in this case, that you're transferring. Everything else, like for example, the plants that I'm gonna be adding in, I'd much rather just draw freehand on my watercolor paper anyway. But what's more important is the window. You want those main shapes of the window to be symmetrical. You want those rectangles to look, pretty straight overall. And that's what I'm focusing on right now. And as long as I am able to see this, as I mentioned before, I am trying to create this outline sketch very lightly anyway, because I don't want my pencil work to show through my paint at the end. So almost always after having done this transferring, I go over certain sections again. I even add a little bit of further detail if I need to. If I need to map out areas of highlights and darkest darks, I also do that at this point as well. And right here, you can see me do just that. I am going over certain segments. I am going to be drawing those plants and those leaves of those trees and defining certain things that I just feel I need before getting started with the next phase of the process. The next phase of this process is going to be already the pen and ink phase. So pen and ink is obviously a permanent medium. So whatever it is that you feel you need to add in with pencil, there is no shame in that. Feel free to add in anything that you feel you might need and take your time. And also related to this, if you feel that you don't need to draw anything with your pencil, and you're confident enough with your pen skills in order to go in with your pen right away and not have that guide with your pencil, then you don't really have to draw things with pencil if you don't need to. So do whatever you have to do for the skill level that you're currently at. You're gonna notice that I think the only sections that I don't trace over at this point are the plants and the leaves of the trees on top of the window. And the reason why I don't even trace over them, why I don't bother with this at this point, is because I'm going to be using a scribbling technique that is very free flowing, and I really need to allow my wrist and my arm to I need to let go when I'm doing the scribbling. Otherwise, it's going to look too organized and too stiff. And I feel that if I focus on tracing over anything when I'm doing scribbling, it kind of defeats the purpose, and the organic, free-flowing, kind of more dynamic marks are not gonna happen. So I leave those areas as they are, and I'm just gonna attack those areas with confidence with my drawing pen in hand. Just allow myself to let go, and what happens, happens. Oftentimes, when it comes to using alternative shading or mark making techniques to describe organic elements like plants and trees and leaves and even flowers, irregularity and little imperfection is desired and it's preferred over very stiff and organized and even perfect lines, because those imperfections describe those organic elements better. So it's okay if we take our time a little bit more when we're tracing over, let's say, the straight lines and more geometric shapes in the window. But when it comes to the plants, you really want to allow yourself to let go a little bit more. All right, so it's about time to get started with the pen and ink phase. Before getting started with the pen and ink, if you feel you have excess graphite anywhere on your sheet of watercolor paper, oftentimes what I like doing is I gently tap over those areas with my soft graphite eraser. You can even use something like a kneaded eraser to gently tap over those areas. And with that out of the way, it's time to get started with the ink. What I'm going to be doing first is tracing over the main geometric shapes of this window. I don't really like referring to these marks and lines as outlines or me outlining anything at this phase, because I really like approaching these kinds of marks as segments and not like me tracing over a shape entirely with one continuous line. You're gonna notice that I leave little tiny sections in which I am intentionally not connecting those lines. I am going about this, especially at this point in the inking process, very carefully and a lot more slowly than what I am going to be doing next with my more organic scribbling and alternative shading techniques. I am taking my time and really tracing over my pencil lines as best as I can, but at the same time, I'm embracing the little irregularities and little wobbles and imperfections that happen along the way. The surface of your paper and its smoothness or its amount of texture is also going to have a great impact on how much that tip of your pen kind of skips over certain sections of your paper. Be careful as you're tracing these lines, but also try to keep your arm moving so that you don't create any stop and start marks accidentally throughout your lines. And also, just generally speaking, by making sure that you're keeping your arm moving, those lines are going to have a natural weight variation throughout, and they're just going to look a lot more flowy and dynamic, and that's what we want. Pen and ink is a wonderful medium that helps us move past our perfectionistic tendencies that so many of us have when we're just getting started, because, you know, we have to embrace the little imperfections that happen. We start understanding how these little imperfections are a huge part in bringing ourselves and personality into the piece. Small irregularities and imperfections here and there provide interest and personality to the piece. And by working with this medium, I have just come to a greater understanding of how important it is to stay mindful throughout the process and go about it with some sort of strategy, depending on what it is I am doing and the overall outcome that I'm going for, but also in embracing the little mishaps and accidents and wobbles and things like that that happen along the way, and incorporating them as part of the piece, continuing to work around them. Not to mention, many times, especially at this point in the process at which we're just getting started with the base kind of line work, We think that the accident is gonna, ruin the whole piece. And then as we move forward, if we allow ourselves to continue with the mark making and even the alternative shading, if that's what we're doing, those little things that look like accidents in the beginning are not even noticeable anymore. So oftentimes I have found that it's a matter of just keeping on with it, allowing ourselves to continue with the piece and not give up on it. All right, so right here, I have finished up with tracing over all of the rectangles in the base shapes of the window. I have traced over those rectangles that are gonna be bricks on top of the window. I have even traced over the visible sections of curtains through the window. And right here, what I am doing is I'm getting started with those scribble marks on top of the window, which are the trees or the leaves of the trees. You can see how I am really just allowing myself to move my arm in any which way. I'm not really going by the pencil lines that I did before. I mean, yeah, I am staying within that area that I've created with my pencil marks, but I am really just doing a whole new kind of scribble mark with my pen. So I am just using my pencil lines as a loose guide for creating those scribbles with my pen. Right here, I'm starting to trace over the little wood or the little logs right beneath the window. And I decide to get started with the front plane of those quote unquote cylinders closer to us in many cases. And then I just draw the diagonal line kind of receding backwards. Now, one tip for you, if your hands are feeling shaky, if you're feeling a little bit, lacking confidence with your pen and ink, one tip I can give you, and this is something that I also suggested in a past watercolor wash and ink tutorial that I've shared here on Patreon, is to actually practice doing little drills for different kinds of lines and marks on a scrap piece of paper or a sketchbook. Oftentimes, even I like doing this before getting started with a new pen and ink piece. It helps you just warm up before getting started, and just you're able to move forward with a little bit more confidence and ease. I remember when I was first getting started with pen and ink and I knew nothing about mark making techniques, nothing about alternative shading techniques, and about the importance of incorporating line weight variation into your line work. I was doing tons of doodles and hand lettering and things like that. And I really feel that practicing simple shapes really helped me increase my confidence. It helped me get to know the medium, and it just helped me just move on to more difficult drawings with a lot more confidence and success. So have that in mind. Doing drills, repeating different kinds of lines and shapes, creating patterns, things like that, they're always super, super helpful, and I would highly recommend making time for them. Do not see that kind of practice as a waste of time, because it's incredibly helpful. Okay, so I worked on my scribbling in those plants right below the window. You can see how I've even added some new scribbles in the inner part of this overall general, very organic, abstract shape created by the scribbling. And now I am adding in some bricks here and there. Notice how the bricks I add in with just simple lines, that I'm not really even outlining the rectangle for the bricks or anything like that. I'm just creating a few lines here and there on random sides of the brick, and yet I'm still able to communicate the illusion of bricks, which just really goes to show how many times less is more, especially when we're using this kind of technique in which we're going for a sketchier, looser, more expressive feel. And we're also combining two mediums, which are ink and watercolor. And when we're combining different mediums like this, I feel it's important to know when to stop or how much to add with one medium and how much to add with another one, because you definitely want to create a balance between the two mediums. You know, you don't want to add way too much detail with one of them if you're going to be bringing in a second one and you're going to be describing more things and adding more detail with the second medium. So it's good to have at least a general idea of how much detail and work you're going to be doing with each. Okay, so I am now moving on to what I would consider to be the second part of this inking process, which basically entails me adding a little bit more detail, a certain sensation of texture. For example, with the little logs, the wood right beneath the window, I added a little bit more of a sensation of wood by adding some marks in the front plane as well as along some of the side planes. And another thing I am doing in this part of the inking process is I am going over certain segments, especially where I want to add further definition and contrast within the main focal point of this picture. So you can see me go over certain sections of the larger shapes that I traced over initially with little tiny scribbling motions, and you don't really have to use scribbling motions. You can actually go over them with another straighter line or something like that. But I really like scribbling because it really helps me define certain sections better, because I am actually overlapping, you know, those little scribbles a little bit more and just making certain sections look a little bit thicker than others. Once again, creating a line weight variation as opposed to one continuous line from one end to the other. That's really what I'm trying to stay away from. So these little tiny scribbling motions that I am adding here and there, as you can see, are making certain segments really pop out. I'm able to define them a little bit more, and I'm also intentionally adding a little bit more not only definition but a little bit more irregularity into certain segments, which is always, at least in my book, going to be more interesting than completely straight uniform lines that have the exact same thickness from one end to the other. However, you can still go in and create variation by just tracing over certain segments that you had already created before with a straight line and just not go over other segments, and you'd be creating that variation in that way. You don't necessarily need to use scribbles. Okay, so I am finishing up with adding a little bit more definition, contrast, and interest to this focal point of this piece. I am done right here, and right about here, I'm gonna get started with basically jumping around the entire thing and just adding a little bit more detail and even texture here and there. Also, in just a bit, I'm gonna get started with adding a little bit of hatching to further define those areas of cast shadow created by some of the elements that are blocking out the light from hitting other elements beneath them or around them. In this kind of situation in which we're mixing mediums, having those hatch marks laid down for you in areas of cast shadow that you're going to be developing with paint later on is helpful, because by having those marks there with your alternative shading techniques, then you already have a good idea of where you're going to be developing those darkest darks via paint. So that's what I'm doing right here. You can see me just adding in my lines. These are referred to as hatching in terms of alternative shading techniques. And it's basically just placing groupings of parallel lines. They don't have to be going off, slanting off in any particular direction. There just has to be a consistency within your groupings of lines, and they have to be parallel, as well as they have to have a somewhat of a consistency between the distance that you're leaving between them. And then cross-hatching would basically be when you add a second grouping of parallel lines on top, intersecting the first group of parallel lines. For this one, I am mainly just using regular hatching because most of that development of darker darks and cast shadows and things like that is going to be created using watercolor. If you're interested in learning more about alternative shading techniques and mark making techniques that a lot of pen and ink artists use to create a sensation of depth and dimension and volume and just interesting effects into their pen and ink drawings and sketches. I would highly recommend checking out past blog posts and videos that I've created in which I explain like 5 or 6 different alternative shading techniques that are the most common ones used. I'm going to make sure to leave links to those down below in the text section of this post so that you can go and check them out if you haven't already. You can definitely create entire pieces using only one type of alternative shading technique, whether it's hatching, cross-hatching, scribbling, stippling, contour lines, cross contour lines. You can use either one of them alone for your entire piece, or you can use them in combination. And I really feel that by exploring several of them, you're not only going to be able to come to a conclusion as to what you like best and what works best for you, but you're also going to have these tools in your tool bag that are going to help you attack new kinds of subjects that pop up that you like to sketch and just achieve more interesting effects because your horizons are all of a sudden gonna open up. Okay, so I am officially done with my pen and ink, and I allowed everything to dry completely. And after waiting a few minutes, I am going over the entire thing with my soft graphite eraser so that I can make sure that I have no pencil marks left anywhere before getting started with my painting process. You're gonna notice that I sweep away all of those eraser bits with my rag that I'm going to be using for my watercolor painting process, instead of using my hand to sweep that away. And the reason this is because I want to avoid leaving any sort of hand oils or whatever it is that I might have on my hand on my watercolor paper, because this can affect the way that the paint gets absorbed into the paper or sits on the paper. All right, so it's time to get started with the final phase for this piece, which is the watercolor painting. And right here, I just wanted to take a little bit of time to swatch out these colors for you, the 6 colors that I'm gonna be using and creating my different color mixtures with, so that you know what we're working with today. And in case you need to change or switch one of these colors because maybe you don't have this specific one, at least you can see what it looks like on camera so that you can make a choice of what you're gonna be replacing it with. First and foremost, before jumping into our paint pans, it's important to prepare the bristles of our paintbrush to take that paint. And to do this, we are going to swivel it in our container of water, remove the excess water, and then go into our paint pans to bring out whatever color we need. So right at the top there, I have my transparent yellow. Below it, I have my raw sienna. Below that, I have my burnt sienna, which is a very deep reddish brown. Right here, I am going to swatch out my permanent blue violet. Then I am going to swatch out my ultramarine deep for you. And finally, I'm going to swatch out my sap green. These are the colors that we're going to be using either alone or in combination to create the different color variations and the different values from very light and translucent to medium to darkest darks throughout our painting. Remember that we always, at least if we're looking for a higher level of realism, we want to make sure that we're creating a nice variation all throughout the piece. Usually I do this by making sure that I'm getting started with the lightest, most translucent version of my colors and working my way towards darker colors as I go, either by allowing the first layer of paint to dry completely before starting in with the next, or by placing a deeper and more saturated version of that color on top of paint that is still wet. And thus, this helps me to develop a wide range of values. It helps me stay in control because I'm always taking it forward incrementally, right? Making sure to get started with very light translucent paint, because if we go in right away with very highly saturated color, very dark and rich color right off the bat, then we're gonna be flattening areas out. Those areas are gonna look very stark and very heavy. And we are completely disregarding all of those lighter values and even transparent areas to happen, which need to be there in order to create a wide variety of different values. So that's something I always make sure to do. And another thing that I always make sure to do before getting started with any sort of watercolor painting process is give thought to what second color I'm gonna be adding into this base color in order to darken it and create those deepest, darkest values. So by this point, you're probably already aware that when it comes to painting with watercolor, all it takes to lighten a color and make it more translucent is add water into your color mixture. And to darken a color and make it more saturated and rich, all you need to do is add more paint into your color mixture and lessen the amount of water. And there's a whole range of values that you can create, from very, very light version of that color, very translucent version, to very deep and dark and rich. However, using only one paint color is most likely than not going to allow you to create very deep contrasting values. And for that, I always like adding in another color to really get those darker values in and make the painting pop. So the first three colors that I prepared for myself are the pure colors with a little bit of water in them. The first square well there on the top left is pure raw sienna. And then on the right of that one, I have my transparent yellow. And right below it, I have pure burnt sienna. And all of these are just the color with a little bit of water in them. You can see how my color mixtures that I'm creating are nice and juicy. They have quite a bit of pigment in them, but also quite a bit of water in them, because I want to make sure that I am going in with quite a bit of paint and water in my paintbrush bristles as I am creating this looser, kind of sketchier painting that I am trying to achieve today. Make sure that you're completely removing the previous color from your paintbrush bristles as you're creating your different color mixtures, because you don't want to start contaminating the colors in your wells of your color mixing palette or bringing a bit of another color into your actual paint pans. You want to keep everything, or at least your colors, separated at this point of the process. All right, and that very deep dark color that I've created on the lower well on the bottom right is a mixture of ultramarine deep and burnt sienna. This creates a very dark, deep brown, which I'm going to be using for the cast shadows that I create below the plants and the leaves of the tree on the wall around the window. I would recommend testing out this ultramarine deep plus burnt sienna color mixture as much as you need to on a scrap piece of watercolor paper until it looks like a deep brown to you. Because if it has more blue than brown, it's gonna look like a dark blue. And if it has kind of a midway amount of each color, it may end up looking like a gray. So you do need more brown in it, more burnt sienna than blue. Okay, and right along the top there, I am creating a light green, a medium green, and a dark green. And I do this by just placing pure sap green in the middle well right there. That's just plain sap green with a bit of water in it. And then to the right of that, I create a mixture of sap green plus transparent yellow, which lightens the green. And finally, to the left of the medium green, I have created a darker green by mixing together sap green plus ultramarine deep. Most often than not, after I have finished with my first color mixtures, my water is totally murky and I need to change it. So that's what I did right here. I need to get started with clean water, and I would recommend you change your water whenever it starts turning murky. Okay, so quick note here. These are by no means all of the color mixtures that we're going to be using, or this is not all of the paint that we're going to be using, because what's important to know is that watercolor painting is a very fluid process in which you're constantly changing the ratios of the different colors in your color mixtures, as well as the color to water ratios in your color mixtures, okay? These are the colors that are gonna get us started, and we're gonna be creating more of whatever it is we need during the process. All right, so having said that, let's go ahead and get started. Right here, I have my clean water with me. I am preparing my paintbrush bristles, making sure that there is no color coming out of them. It's nice and clean. And what I do right here is I load up my paintbrush bristles with this very first color that I'm going to be painting with, which is my pure burnt sienna with quite a bit of water in it. And once my paintbrush has been loaded with this first color, I go in and very loosely start painting in the wall around the house. You can see how watery and relatively translucent that paint color is as I start painting it in. Now, make sure that your paintbrush is not dripping all over the place, because yes, we're definitely loading up our paintbrush with quite a bit of water and paint in its bristles, but we do not want to start losing control here. And if the paintbrush is dripping paint all over the place, that's going to be a problem. So even though I am loading up my paintbrush, I am making sure that it's not dripping. And if I notice that there is any excess paint dripping off, I either gently scrape the very tip of my paintbrush alongside the wall of my paint mixing palette, or I tap the tip of my paintbrush on my absorbent towel, and that should take care of the problem. Lack of water control is one of the most difficult and challenging things, I think, when we're getting started with watercolor. It definitely comes to you with practice. But for now, just know that I am constantly removing the excess water and paint from my paintbrush bristles by gently scraping my paintbrush bristles alongside my container of water whenever I go into it. I'm also constantly using my absorbent towel as I go, whether it is to blot those bristles on it or actually go in and do some lifting. If I accidentally place way too much water or paint on my watercolor paper, I immediately go in with my absorbent towel and lift up whatever amount of paint and water I can. And I am also gently scraping my bristles alongside the walls of my paint mixing palette. So we're constantly gauging, just staying mindful of how wet or damp our paper already is, how watery our paint mixtures are, and how much water and paint are already in our paintbrush bristles. Okay, so I lay down my first light brown all throughout the wall area, around the window and around the plants and everything. And I am working in a very warm space with a fan on top of my head when I was creating this. So my paint was starting to dry pretty fast, and I actually wanted to go in on wet paint to drop in my second darker brown so that I could have wet on wet effects and soft transitions between them. And because of this, I decided to go in and do more wetting all throughout this area with a clean, slightly dampened paintbrush, and I am basically re-wetting this entire area so that I can drop in the next brown in areas of cast shadow. So remember, this deeper, darker brown was created by mixing together ultramarine deep and burnt sienna. I am testing it out right here before dropping it in, and I highly recommend you do it as well. So I loaded up my paintbrush with this color after I had tested it out, and I am starting to drop it into the damp paper, creating very nice wet on wet effects. And what I mean by this is this darker brown is gently dissipating and blurring out into the lighter brown that we had placed before. And the reason this happens is because the paper is wet. Remember that watercolor is always going to expand and bleed into paper that is wet or even partially damp. The amount of bleeding and the quickness that this happens is going to depend on the amount of water that is on your paper, but it's always going to happen at least a bit if that paper is damp. So we really need to think of when we want those soft transitions, that blurring out, and when we want sharper edges to the shapes that we start painting in. In this case, I really wanted that blurring out to happen. And one more thing that I really want to mention here is whenever you're placing a very deep and saturated color, because if you notice this color mixer that I have on my mixing palette right there, it's a very deep and saturated brown color mixture right there. So what I wanted to say is that if you place this deep dark color mixture on paper that is damp, it's going to look softer when you place it on your paper because there is water on your paper, right? But if this paper was completely dry and I went in with that very deep dark brown, that brown would look so much darker and so much starker because that paper is dry and that paint is not mixing with water that is already there and it's not dissipating outward. Okay, so I placed a little bit of that darker brown underneath some bricks here and there before allowing all of that first layer of brown all throughout the wall to dry completely. And now you're seeing me get started with the first layer of green, and I am starting with the trees on top of the window. For the trees and the plants beneath the window, I am really making use of a scribbling motion with the tip of my paintbrush. And as I am doing those very light scribbling motions, you can see how I've allowed little tiny sections of white paper to shine through completely. I left them unpainted. With my initial layer of light and translucent green still wet, I go in and start placing my deeper and darkest green, which is the sap green that is mixed together with the ultramarine deep. And I start dropping it in only into certain little sections here and there. I definitely do not want to cover up and have this darker green completely overtake the lighter green that I have placed before it. Because remember that the reason why we created these different greens and our different color mixers that we're going to be creating is to be able to develop a wide range of values, so lights, midtones, and darks, as well as a good variety of colors, right? And so if I start mindlessly just dropping in the darker green while that initial lighter green is still wet, then most likely than not, this is going to lead to flatness, especially because that paper is still wet and that color that you start laying down is going to start dissipating outwards. So use a light touch, drop in a bit of darker green at a time. And if you feel that you're starting to lose control of your water, that maybe your paper is, way too wet, it has a puddle in there and you're dropping in more water, so a mess is getting created, sometimes it's best to even allow that initial layer to soak into the paper just a tiny bit and then drop in the second color. Okay, so right here I have started painting in kind of the same process that I was using before with the trees on top. I am going in with my lighter green first in these plants that are right under the window, kind of hanging downwards from this rectangular sort of flower pot. You can see all of the little white spaces that I have left as I am painting in this lighter green. And it's going to be the same thing. We're going to be dropping in our darker green while this first layer is still wet. Now, notice how in this case for these little plants, I'm actually leaving even more white space, larger white spaces when compared to the leaves of the tree that I painted at the top. And the reason why is because I'm actually going to be dropping in a little bit of my bright yellow color in order to create the faint illusion of little yellow flowers. Now, if you want to drop in some red or even purple or whatever color you'd like, instead of yellow to create those illusions of little flowers, please do. You don't have to use yellow. The thing is that I'm already using, like I'm going out of my comfort zone with the colors in this piece. I usually don't make too much use of colors like bright purple, the one that I'm gonna be using for the doors and the window. And usually I just like keeping those pops of brighter colors a little bit more limited. So this is just a taste thing. I knew that the yellow would merge in and not be too noticeable against the light green and the other greens here because yellow is analogous to green in the color wheel. However, feel free to be adventurous when it comes time to placing our little flowers, and use any color that you feel you'd like. We're not at that point yet because in order to place in those flowers, I want to wait for these initial greens to dry completely. But make sure to leave those little white spaces where you're gonna be dropping in whatever color it is you're gonna be using. All right, so I have placed my initial lighter green. I have dropped in a darker green in certain little areas. I'm arriving at nice kind of soft transitions with the wet on wet. And right now I am just doing some little tiny moving around of paint, softening some harsh edges that I feel are way too distracting. You can do this by going in with a clean and only slightly dampened paintbrush and move that paint around just a tiny bit, but don't go overboard because in order to create a fresher kind of look, a sketchier, looser look, we really need to abstain from being too finicky and moving our paint around on and on and on. If you're gonna do any moving around, just use a very, very light touch. Go in with a clean and only slightly dampened paintbrush and do some minimal moving around if you need to. All right, so it was time to allow those greens to dry before painting in the flowers. And in the meantime, I am creating that initial layer of light brown all throughout the ground and the little logs beneath the window. The color that I use for that initial layer in this area is created with a mixture of burnt sienna and raw sienna. It's heavier on the raw sienna than the burnt sienna. Raw sienna is the lighter version of the two, and we're definitely going for a lighter brown. So you need to control those ratios of those colors. And even with this color mixture being light brown, you want to go in with a transparent color mixture that has quite a bit of water in it. I would recommend testing your color mixer out on your scrap piece of watercolor paper before going in, especially because as with everything else throughout this painting, you really want to go in with a lighter brown, and then you're going to be developing darker browns in areas that require it, but you really need those lighter values first. Hopefully you can see how even with that first layer of lighter brown, I left little tiny sections of paper shining through completely, and I just embraced those natural little unpainted sections to happen. I let them be because this is gonna help me create that illusion of highlights and that illusion of light. After that initial layer of lighter, more translucent brown was set in place, I allowed my paper to soak up that paint a tiny bit before going in with my deep dark brown, which is once again the mixture created with ultramarine deep and burnt sienna. And as I am dropping in this deeper, darker brown, I have in my head that choice or that decision that I made in the beginning of this painting process, in which I decided that the light source was gonna be above and to the left of this window. Now, these little logs and pieces of wood are very irregularly shaped. So I am being very loose about how I place these cast shadows and little darker areas throughout them and the little pile. I'm really thinking of how they are overlapping and their structure overall. But I did make sure to place a wash of this deeper, darker brown right below the logs and to the right of them, which is opposite to the light source, which is above and to the left of them. Whenever I am painting something that I drew from my imagination or by combining several different references, I really have to make use of my knowledge of light behavior if my intention is to make this look believable. Because it's one thing to work from one single reference photo that is informing you of where all of the areas of cast shadows and occlusion shadows and all the different values throughout the subject itself are located, and it's quite another to work from your imagination, right? Because you have to use your knowledge of light behavior, which I highly recommend looking into, because light behavior is an art fundamental and it goes hand in hand with shading something effectively. And of course, I really do believe that when we're just getting started with learning about light behavior and how to make something look a little bit more believable, it's essential to work from references, because you're learning about the theory, you're learning about light behavior and art fundamentals, but you have to connect that knowledge to, seeing and observing something in real life. You're seeing how that knowledge is actually shown or demonstrated in either a photo form or something that you have right in front of you in real life. That is how all of this information gets set into your brain to the point that you're able to shade something a little bit more in a believable way, even when you're working from your imagination. If you don't stem from the use of references, then that's going to be very, very hard to do. All right, so after having finished with the light brown and the dark brown in the little pile of wood and the ground, I allowed that to dry. I started placing in little tiny drops of my yellow. This is pure transparent yellow with a bit of water in it, here and there in the little sections of white space that I left throughout the little plants under the window. You can see the little tiny specks of bright yellow throughout some sections here and there in the plants, throughout those greens beneath the window. As I said, I really wanted to keep these little illusions of yellow flowers just muted out and blending together with the greens, but you can totally decide to drop in some red or even blue, whatever color you want. I dropped in that yellow on dry paper. And right here, I am getting started with the first layer of bright purple on the doors of the window. This is a purple color mixture that I created by mixing together permanent blue violet, which is a very bright purple, with a little bit of burnt sienna. Since burnt sienna is a brown or neutral, it's gonna help me just neutralize this very bright purple just a tiny bit. I would recommend exploring, shifting around the ratios of your purple and your burnt sienna until you arrive at a purple that you personally like. And hey, if you want to go in with your pure, very bright purple with no brown added in, you can do that as well. The important thing is to go in with a semi-translucent color. You can see how that initial purple that I went in with was pretty translucent. It had quite a bit of water in it. And at this point, I'm getting started with a more saturated version of that purple. And by starting to drop in the second purple, I am just starting to create a little tiny bit of illusion of cast shadow here and there and darkening just certain areas within the doors. After finishing with this, I am going to allow those doors to dry completely, and later on, we're gonna be coming back to them to darken certain areas even further. All right, so it was time to allow those doors to dry, and I am doing the exact same thing that I did with the doors to paint in this rectangular flower pot holding up these plants under the window. First, I went in with a semi-translucent version of that purple mixture, and then I went in to drop a little bit of a more saturated purple color mixture in only tiny areas here and there, focusing more on the areas of cast shadow that those plants would create because they're overlapping that pot. Be careful though, because this is kind of a small area and you don't want that darker purple to completely overtake the lighter purple values. Remember to try to create a wide variety of different values and transparencies all throughout your piece. in a way that makes sense, of course, in accordance to light behavior, the way that objects would naturally create shadows upon each other, etc. All right, so with that done, I started adding a little bit of gray, a very light translucent gray on the frame of that window. So my intention is to make that frame of that window appear white. And painting white objects with watercolor is oftentimes challenging because we definitely want to create at least somewhat of a variety of values within it, maybe at least 2 or 3 different values, but we do not want to cover up that white to a point that the object just doesn't seem white anymore. So there's definitely a balance when it comes to painting white objects or subjects with watercolor. But you can see how for now I mainly left that light gray in the framing, the outermost framing around that window. And the way that I created this gray is, of course, you probably know by now, by mixing together burnt sienna plus ultramarine deep. It's the exact same color combination that we have been using for our deeper, darker browns, only this time I have more of a 50-50 ratio of my dark blue and my brown, which is gonna look more grayish. As I was mentioning before, if you shift around the ratios of these colors, it's gonna look either more on the brownish side, more on the bluish side, or gray. So do a little bit of shifting right there on your color mixing palette. Test out your color on your scrap piece of watercolor paper, and when it looks gray to you, then you can add a little bit of water into your color mixer. Make sure that you go in nice and translucent with that gray and add it to that outermost framing. Then allow it to dry. I want to make sure that I allow that to dry completely before going in to add a more saturated version of this gray only in certain areas to further develop a wider range of gray values. At least, as I said, a couple in this very small area. Okay, so you can see how I started to paint in the curtains, the visible sections of curtains that we're able to see through the window. And it looks a little tiny bit different from the purple that I used for the doors of the window, and this is an intentional choice I made. You can decide if you want to use that same exact purple color mixer for those windows, or if you're doing what I am doing and you're combining your purple, in my case it's my permanent blue violet with a tiny bit of burnt sienna, then you can alter those ratios a little bit to make that purple look a little tiny bit different from the doors. So that's up to you. Whichever purple or other color you decide to go in with, that's perfectly okay. It's up to you and your tastes. Just remember to go in with a translucent version of that color first, and then you can go in and darken certain areas by dropping in a little more of that color only into certain areas that you want to darken. You can probably see how throughout the doors of the window and even in the curtains, you're able to see little tiny sections of either very, very translucent paint or just, the whiteness of the paper shining through completely that I left unpainted. And this is something that I am doing intentionally, just like what I did with the pile of wood on the ground beneath the window and the plants and everything like that. I am using that brightness and that beauty of the paper shining from under this translucent paint to help me create a wide variety of values, because these would be the highlights, right? And if I ignore the highlights and I don't have any of that whiteness of my paper anywhere, then I would be getting rid of the lightest lights, the lightest values. Thus, I would be limiting the amount of different values that I, want to create more of a believable look. Another thing to have in mind is that when we're working with this medium, we're working in unison. We're using a translucent medium in combination with the whiteness and the lightness of the paper underneath to create vibrant paintings, light paintings with a vibrant use of color that seem to glow from within. And if we mindlessly go over everything with a uniform layer of color, we're approaching it as if we were using an opaque painting medium such as acrylics or oils, and this is not what we're using here. We're using watercolor, and in many ways, watercolor is a total opposite from using opaque painting mediums. So always think of how you can use the whiteness of the paper under your paint to your advantage to create a nice, light, glowy painting. Don't try to cover it up because that is not the point. Okay, so right here, I have started going into certain areas of my painting which were completely dry by this point, and started going in with a rich, saturated version of that same paint color that I was using underneath. You saw me do that in the rectangular flower pot. You also saw me doing that in some sections of the curtains, and also on the doors on the sides of the window. And after having done that, I painted in the first gray layer of that section in which we're able to see into the house through the window. And right now what I am doing is I am pushing those darkest darks in the wall around the window. You can see how I'm going in wet on dry. Everything is completely dry by this point, so you can see those sharp defined edges around the shapes that I am painting in. And then once I feel I have placed enough of this saturated color on my paper, you're gonna notice that what I do is I remove all of the color from my paintbrush bristles and I go in with a clean and only slightly dampened paintbrush to move that paint around just a tiny bit, very, very gently. And this is gonna help me soften those edges and move my paint around in different ways so that I can better describe the three-dimensional form of whatever it is I am painting in. Like what I did with the bricks right there on top of the window, I actually did a little bit of pulling of that paint that was still wet. I pulled it to the right and further created that illusion of that structure of the bricks. What I like doing is, as I was mentioning at the beginning, taking it a step at a time. I really want to carve out those darkest darks, but at the same time, I don't want to mindlessly start placing more and more paint on my watercolor paper, because this can lead to flatness, and I definitely do not want to cover up my previous values that I've already developed. The darker and more saturated I get with my color mixtures, the more mindful I am about only placing this darker color in areas that I really need to make darker. So I'm continuing to place a little bit more of this deeper and darker brown in little areas here and there. And in some cases, I am removing the color from my paintbrush bristles and going in to soften those edges by running my paintbrush bristles along those edges of those sharp defined shapes. As long as you go in while that paint is still wet, you should be able to soften them at least a bit so that those edges are not too defined. But in other cases, I just leave those sharp edges be, because in realism, when we're looking at a photo, or even you can see this in highly realistic drawings or paintings, in realism, there is going to be a combination of softer transitions or gradients between your different values with sharp defined edges between different values. There's going to be a combination of the two. So I don't always go in and try to soften everything out. I try to create a painting that has a combination of the two at the end. I went in and added more of this deeper, darker, more saturated brown in some areas here and there on the little pile of wood beneath the window. And you can notice how when it came to adding in this deeper, darkest brown color mixture, I mostly added it into the sections where it made sense, opposite to the light source, more so on the right side of this pile of wood. As we go in, carving those darkest darks, I want to take a moment to remind you guys to stay away from the look of outlines or stark looking lines or shapes. Stay very irregular as you're carving out these darkest darks, and think of these as abstract shapes more than any sort of line, because lines are going to retract from the realism of the piece. Okay, so my painting is completely dry by this point, and I am going in with saturated versions of the colors that I've already been using before in these sections, and I am going in to deepen and darken some areas. I carved out some darkest darks in the flower pot right beneath the window. I also deepened some areas in the, area where we're able to see through the window into the house with that dark gray color mixture. And I also went in to darken some sections further on the purple doors using my purple color mixture. We are almost done with this piece, and at this point in the process, I just want to add a little bit more texture to the wall around the window. I am using a semi-translucent version of one of the very first color mixers that I used for this piece, which is a combination of raw sienna and burnt sienna, heavier on the raw sienna, which is the lighter of the two, and just creating a faint illusion of a few more bricks around the window. After having done that, I allowed my painting to dry completely, because this is a part of the process that I often do when I am just finishing up my watercolor paintings, which is a final wash of bright but translucent color that is going to help bring everything together. Sometimes I do this to slightly change the color temperature, to liven up certain colors, etc. But what I am doing right here is I am using a light translucent version of my burnt sienna, and I'm going in very loosely to add this final wash of color all throughout the wall, and I also added this wash of color on the wood pile under the window. I am being very light, very loose. If certain areas are left uncovered, I embrace them. That's actually a good thing, to leave those little sections of the previous colors and values shining through completely. It's important to go in very loosely, very lightly with this wash of color at the end. You do not want to cover up the previous values that you've already developed, and you do not want to move those previous layers of paint around. So make sure you're going in with a burnt sienna that is nice and translucent. Test this out on your scrap piece of watercolor paper, and also make sure that you're going in once your paint has completely settled into your paper. Everything has to be nice and dry. All right, so the very last thing that I am doing here is carving out some very darkest darks, using the exact same colors that I have been using for this area throughout this painting process. You can see me create at least another value there on the white framing around the window. You can see me carve out those darkest grays in the area through which we're able to see into the house. Watercolor is always going to dry at least a bit lighter than how it looks when it's wet. So if you're looking to create high levels of contrast in your pieces, oftentimes it's going to be good to go back after your painting has dried and reassess if you want to push some darkest darks a bit further. And right here, I decide to go in and add a little bit more of an illusion of shadow behind the pile of wood under the window. And I am using my deep dark brown color combination created with a mixture of ultramarine deep and burnt sienna. Notice how again I am focusing on adding this shadow in the areas opposite to the light source. And because I am painting this in with my paper completely dry, I am able to see sharp defined outlines. So what I do is I do a little bit of moving around of that paint with a clean and only slightly dampened paintbrush, and I do a little bit of lifting with my absorbent towel along the way to soften things up. All right, everyone, and with that, we have completed this pen and watercolor wash piece. I so hope that you enjoyed this one, that you learned something new, that it inspired you to get on creating and working on your art. And if you did give this one a go, I would love to hear from you. I would love to know how it went, if you struggled with anything, what you succeeded at, if you changed anything up, what it is that you did. If you want to share with me, you can always post it over in the community tab here on Patreon. You can share it with me privately via email. You can always find me at hello@ericalancaster.com, or you can post it via your favorite social media channel. Just make sure to tag me so that I can make sure to see it and cheer you on. Thank you so very much for checking this one out today. See you very, very soon for another post here on Patreon or over on social media channels, and have a beautiful rest of the week. Bye, guys.